Okay, we're gonna get going, everyone. Hello, everyone. My name is Dylan Judd, and I'm a third-year PhD student at the Yale School of the Environment. For the past 13 years, BIOMES, short for Bridging Issues and Optimizing Methods in Environmental Studies, has served as the school's premier platform for bringing groundbreaking research to the YSE community. I'm honored to introduce today's BIOMES speaker, Dr. Helen Poulos, a distinguished associate professor in the College of the Environment and Environmental Studies at Wesleyan University. Helen is the principal investigator behind Wesleyan's Forest and Global Change Lab, which studies forest dynamics in response to natural and anthropogenic stressors and the efficacy of adaptive forest management. The research ranges from understanding singular species propagation to regional impacts of fire on a landscape. Upon graduation with an undergraduate degree from Pepperdine University, Helen spent 2 years in Honduras in the Peace Corps, where she worked with natural resource management in rural eastern Honduras. She then completed a master's degree in geography from Pennsylvania State University and received her PhD from YSE under the supervision of Mark Ashton. Helen has authored over 55 peer-reviewed publications and popular articles on a range of environmental topics and served as a wonderful mentor for me during my time at Wesleyan. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Poulos to the stage.
Hopefully you can hear me on this mic. Yes? No? Mic is working. Okay. Up. I don't know how to do up. Okay, maybe you can hear me now. Okay, great. Well, Dylan, thanks for that warm welcome. It's exciting to see you here in your third year of your PhD program after being an undergrad with me. And thanks to all of you for coming today. I'm going to be talking to you about understanding wildfire in the Anthropocene, and then giving you some examples of how I'm studying that question vis-a-vis my own research. And so just to kind of start off, I'm going to give us sort of a little theoretical framework for thinking about people and fire on planet Earth. And so the Earth is a fire planet, and we, people, humans, are a fire species. And so Stephen Pine is a famous fire ecologist and writer, and this is a quote from a Scientific American article that he wrote some time ago. Earth is a fire planet, the only one we know of. Earth has fire because it has life. Life created the oxygen that fire needs. Life created and arranges the fuel it requires. Even the chemistry of fire is biochemistry. Fire takes apart what photosynthesis puts together. As long as terrestrial life has existed, so has fire. And so here's some examples. So we know that there are fossilized plants with charcoal dating back to about at least 420 million years ago, right? And so these are just a few examples that we're aware of using carbon dating. But really, the story of fire coming into the history of Earth has to do with plants, right? And so what we see here is there's a lot of different interesting things that have happened over time. And these are just some contextual examples for you to get your brain around what 400 to 450 million years ago is and what happened before that. And so what we have is the invasion of land plants onto the terrestrial portion of Earth, right? That means plants can now photosynthesize, so we have oxygen. And when oxygen goes above about 15%, we can have combustion because we have this fire triangle over here showing you what creates a flame, right? And we also have fuel, right? And so there's lots of different interesting things going on here, but those are the main key points, is that plants moving onto land, creating fuel and oxygen, are responsible for when fires entered the scene on Earth. And then now we move ourselves a whole bunch further along in time, and humans start to tame fire in the Pleistocene. So from ice comes fire, and then all of this evolution of how humans were able to tame fire and use it for like cooking food, for example. And then once you're able to eat foods that are cooked, you have high protein, high fats, and evolutionary development of the brain, for example. So we know that fires have been part of human history and for a very long time. And in fact, the domestication of fire, right, is one of sort of the top 3 things that differentiates us as like special humanoids, right? That being the development of language and technology being the other 2. And we know there are lots and lots of human stories about fire, right? So you can go to Rockefeller Center and you can see Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. And we have lots and lots of accounts and stories of people's relationship and how fire was given to humans, including one of my favorites, Native American story of the Thunderbird, which is both fire creator and destructive force. And then of course, if we bring this into the 20th century, we think about like the ultimate power of fire for things like the nuclear bomb. And so this is sort of my best estimate up here of like the ways in which people have and do use wildfires in history and today. So you can see it's quite a tool, right? And over time, people have been stewards of fire across large landscapes for millennia, right? And so Stephen Pine sort of talks about 2 different kinds of fire, right? Fire primeval as this companion on our journey as stewards of the earth, right? And you can see how, you know, indigenous knowledge is embedded in that kind of characterization of fire, right? Fire stewardship. And then there's Promethean fire, right? Fire as the technological power disruptor and way to break things apart, right? And so those are ways in which we've interacted with fire and thought about fire and its use have changed a lot over time as well. And so just gonna kind of go through sort of Pine's ideas of how fires have come across, have moved across the landscape and how our changing relationship with fire has worked over time. First fire, right? Organic matter. Vegetation burns. It's limited mainly by the type of vegetation and how flammable it is, right? And then how much oxygen and weather and other things I'm going to talk about in a minute, right? Then second fire is the taming of fire. The man grabs the torch, the firebrand, the using of fire and domestication of it, which expands where fires happen, right? But still ecologically limited. And then Stephen Pine calls this the Pyrrhic transition. Essentially, the third fire is where we turn to burning fossil fuels, ancient fuels from ancient plants underground, right? That we're now combusting inside human vessels, like our factories, like our fire engines, like our homes, right? And our cars. And so this completely reorganizes how fire is used, both on like a time scale, right, perspective, on a spatial scale perspective, and on a magnitude scale, right? And so in the third fire, we're seeing all these crazy things happen, right? Like climate change is blowing, we're blowing all this CO2 into the atmosphere from these fossil fuels deep within the ground, right? And then we have things like fire exclusion and fire suppression, where we've directly put fires out for a long time. And we've also excluded fires by putting lots of livestock on the landscape to remove fuels that move fires around. And so this third fire is now leading to what Stephen Pine calls the piracy, right? And so I think this is an apt way to sort of think about fire ecology research. I teach this book in my class as well at Wesleyan. But this is what all of us are sort of starting to see in the news, right? More fire, bigger fire, more fire, bigger fire, all over the globe, and especially in the US as well. And so for the rest of this talk, I want to sort of try to make some sense of the piracy, right? I'm going to talk about the fire science because, I mean, maybe all of you in here are expert fire ecologists, but I'm suspecting that many interests are in the room. So I want to talk about some sort of basic fire science. Then I want to talk about applied fire science research. And I'm going to give you examples from my own work from California and the Southwestern United States. And then finally, of course, what can we do about it? How can we mitigate fire risk and impacts in the piracy? So first with fire science, this is a very typical image for the Western United States or the United States in general in recent years in summer, but also even in winter, right? And so we know this from satellite imagery that there are all these fire hotspots all over the United States in summer, right? And then I've already shown this fire triangle, but you know, in order to have fire, you have to have oxygen, which of course plants produce, fuels, which of course plants produce, and ignitions, right? And those are from lightning but also from humans. And human ignitions can be accidental or on purpose, right? The Great Yellowstone Fire, in 1988, none of you were probably, half of you weren't alive. What started it? Does anybody remember? A US Forest Service person burned a love letter and it caught all of the Yellowstone on fire, right? So accidental or arson, cultural or prescribed, but fire and people have been around for a long time, right? And then, and so, how do these fires ignite? This AI image, very incorrect. You couldn't possibly have these over here next when the lightning is just striking, but I love AI images for that reason. But so, okay, lightning, that's the fundamental thing that's igniting fires, right, over time, right? But people are the big one today, right? And so we see both in terms of the number of fires and the area burned. We've also expanded the fire niche. Jennifer Belch, went to school with her here as well, has shown that fires are happening in all these different places that they didn't happen before, and they're happening during times of year that they didn't happen in historical time periods when it was limited to only dry seasons. People can play with matches anytime. And so building on that fire triangle, the fire behavior triangle is really the sort of theoretical construct that we use for thinking about what drives how fires burn. So when I talk about fire behavior, I'm talking about fire intensity, severity, or how much vegetation is killed, flame height, right? Those are all different things that are result in fire behavior from things like pre-fire weather, or if it's windy, or if there's lots of fuels, or if it's rocky, right? Or steep, where fires run up hillsides. And so in order to ignite that fire, you need dry weather, right? Usually hot weather also, and then fuel. And so globally, where do these things occur? Where do these fires occur? They occur pretty much in a lot of places all over the globe, but it's like the Goldilocks kind of condition, right? So you got to have enough moisture where there's fuel to grow there, vegetation, and it can't be too wet so that you have ignition, right, with heat. And so this is an example of where it's too wet or too dry or not enough fuel, or where there are lots of fires. And you see that there are fires all over the planet, and they have been for 420 million years, more or less, right? And then in the United States, we also see fire hazard risk in a lot of dry places with rugged topography, but also in wetter places like the Southeast, which also have lots of flammable vegetation. And so just some more background, when we talk about fires, we use this term fire regime. So that's not just like how an individual fire burned, but how a fire would have burned over centuries to millennia. And we can characterize that as like the type. Is it a surface or a crown fire? Is it frequent or infrequent? Is it severe? Did it damage lots of vegetation or little, et cetera? And so, but there's two kind of basic types of fire regimes that are like at the end of this spectrum. And so essentially we have surface fire regimes like this, where you have low severity, frequent fire, low flame lengths, and doesn't kill everything, right? And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have high severity, could be frequent or infrequent crown fire that consumes all the vegetation. And then in topographically dissected landscapes, you can have mixed regimes, right, that are some kind of mixture of all those things across an entire fire footprint or area. And then plants over evolutionary time have evolved all these different interesting adaptations to deal with like living in a frequent low severity fire regime or a high severity one. So this is an example: grow thick bark, right? Or self-prune branches that are lower, so you don't have like fuels going from the forest floor all the way to the crown. As soon as a fire hits the canopy, it gets very high intensity or severity, right? Lots of heat. And so in crown fire regimes, similarly, we have these kinds of adaptations as well, right? So we've got things like serotinous cones. So you have heat release that opens the cones after a high severity fire, because in this type of an environment, everything is killed, right? This fire resprouting, the roots don't get killed, and then they can resprout. Or seed banking, in the last picture here, which would be that you have lots and lots of seeds. You get that some of them might even be heat germinated, right? And then you get obligate cedar species coming in after that. And then there are all these places that don't burn much, like these sugar maple forests that we have here. They're fire sensitive. The oak forest here, as you may know, do like some fire. But that's kind of the fire science background, right? And now I kind of want to move into like applied fire science, right? So based on sort of what I've told you, I'm going to talk about some ways in which I've tried to use those concepts to think about how fires work and how we can mitigate their risk in the Pyrocene. So first, I'll talk about the California wildfire. So this one hit home for me. I'm from Southern California. I bet there are others from Southern California here in this room. I watched from afar. I went to Pepperdine, as Dylan said. So this was something that I was fascinated with, mostly because it was sort of the perfect firestorm of everything I teach in my fire ecology class happening all at once. And so let's start off with the California 2024 fire season. It wasn't like remarkable because there was a lot of rain. So there weren't a lot of fires in 2024, not a lot of fatalities. If you compare 2024 acres burned to acres burned in 2020, that record drought year that happened a few years ago, it wasn't a big deal, right? But then we had this giant, crazy fire, set of fires, right? I'm only going to talk about the Palisades fire, but the Eaton fire, and there were other fires, the Franklin fire before that, that caused extensive damage, right? Lots of fatalities, the most expensive wildfire like ever, because all these millionaires were living there, right? So how did this happen? What caused this firestorm? Well, we've had these wet winters in California, 2023, 2024, followed by a very dry summer and fall at the end of the year. And so what did that do? Well, that term of like having a really wet condition followed by a really dry condition is this new cool term, hydrological whiplash. Does that sound so cool or what? Right? And so that caused lots of vegetation growth, followed by those fuels drying out, followed by lots of people living in the urban wildland interface that is LA, amongst steep, rocky terrain with vegetation that has really waxy properties. And then you get Santa Ana winds, and boom, you get a big deadly fire. And what happens after? Okay, so that's actually what I'm studying right now, is that you get this real change in surface hydrology, right? So not only do these images show like how there's a lot more surface runoff, but there are actually hydrophobic soils in LA from these waxy chaparral vegetation, and so that makes the water run off even more. And so that can lead to sedimentation and debris flows. And then, California is unique in many ways, right? It's got steep coastal ranges, small watersheds, and you can see a big increase in sediment flows after fire in these watersheds. A lot of wildland urban interface, that WUI term I'll be using throughout. And then the hydroclimatic whiplash, and then climate change making those more unpredictable in recent years. And so just to give you an example, this is one of the watersheds that we're working with. This is like beautiful Malibu weather, lots of vegetation, and the mouth of the river. And here's after the fire, right? High severity fire, killed all the vegetation. I would not want to be surfing there when this picture was taken, right? And so going kind of back to what this means is that you can have this altered hydrology that has negative water quality effects after fire. And then the question that we were trying to look at is what drives bacterial concentrations in these watersheds after the fire. And so along with my student, Jesse Chang-Frieden, and colleagues from the Jet Propulsion Lab, we're answering this question of what sort of how the water cycle changes after fire and how that influences bacteria. We used some precipitation data, remotely sensed precipitation data, and then the Beach Watch citizen science total coliform data, which is basically taken about weekly for many decades of time, to try to look at how different types of weather patterns are influencing these types of flushes and how fire severity interacts with that relationship. And so what we can see here is that there's a lot of variability in this data set. It's messy. We've only been working on it for like a few months, but essentially pre-fire versus the 5 or 6 months after the fire in these high severity watershed, the high severity watershed around the Palisades fire, the one on the right, we see an increase in E. coli or fecal coliforms in those locations in dry weather after the fire. But in wet weather, we see a 27-time increase in fecal coliform concentrations at the mouths of these rivers in these high severity watersheds, right? And so again, I wouldn't want to go surfing in those waters. So we're continuing to work on this, but the preliminarily is that you've got dramatic increases in coliform presence, especially after rainfall, right? And that has to do with runoff. We're using more complex models to look at this, and we're looking at sediment plumes, and we're looking at vegetation cover as well. Those are sort of our next steps. So now kind of transitioning, now we talked about the California sort of question and how I'm addressing it or how my group is addressing it. I want to talk now about these southwestern USA mega fires. And so same story in the American Southwest, lots of fires, more fires, bigger fires, right? Why? We've already talked about this, right? Climate change, it's drier, and there's drier fuels and therefore more extreme fire behavior. Likewise, changing fuel beds are also responsible, so fire suppression, but things like invasive grasses, more people, more ignitions, all things I've sort of talked about are creating this more extreme fire behavior. And so what we see is more and more mega fires. So when I use that term mega fire, that's a fire that's over 100,000 hectares in size, okay? And so there's lots of them, and they're all like recent. That's bad. Maybe, right? And so what we see is like these forests are changed, right? So I want to give you some visual images, right? So this forest on the left is like a restored forest, but that's what you would have seen prior to people putting fires out, or Smoky Bear, right? And then this is a fire suppressed forest, lots of fuel, lots of canopy cover, right? Maybe gonna burn real hot. And so what I've shown in past studies and in this picture, which is a repeat historical image, is that these forests have densified. Is that a word? Yes, I guess. Right. And I published a bunch of papers looking at the impacts of that and then the subsequent impacts of that on wildfires. But these are just some pictures of what that actually looks like in some of these southern Arizona systems that I work on along the US-Mexico border. Right. So a low severity fire would maintain that structure of pines and oaks or multiple species, moderate severity somewhere in between with some seedling regeneration. High severity fire here over on the right is dead pine trees and oak resprouts, right? So you're looking at different regeneration mechanisms. And so I'm going to give you an example now of like the impacts of high severity fire, right? So high severity fire may, like we're talking about like a potential fire regime shift, right? Where we're no longer seeing frequent low severity fires that used to happen, and now we're seeing high severity fire. And so the worry is that when high severity fire happens, you get this up to 10 or 15 years after a fire, still no new pines, for example, from some of my studies, right? And so like there's a transition in species composition, there's a transition in the function of this forest. And so people are really worried about it, like, is this a novel ecosystem? And there's always this debate like, oh, let's just give it time. That's always one of the manager strategies. You give it time. But you know, I'm not sure after almost 20 years studying this that giving it time is enough. And so we're going to talk about also like things we can do about this, right? So here's just one example. I wanted to kind of keep this current with the research that I've been doing recently. And so I've been working with the EcoStress evapotranspiration sensor. It's on the International Space Station, and it is a remotely sensed product that basically gives you evapotranspiration data. So when we talk about evapotranspiration, right, it's like water being moved from the atmosphere, either through direct evaporation or through plants, right? When I tell people about evapotranspiration in trees, I tell you to think about trees as straws. So like fans of pipe theory, right? You get more straws, less water in the soil, right? Bigger straws, they use more water, right? And so keep this in mind when I talk about this. But first of all, the picture that I showed you back here, right? These are the examples of kind of like the transition. On the left is the pine oak forest, and on the right is high severity fire. And I was looking at how evapotranspiration in the post-fire environment using vegetation plot data and EcoStress evapotranspiration data to try to understand how the post-fire environment hydrology varied across vegetation types. So pine oak forest is intact forest. The hotter the severity of the fire, as that's DNBR, the lower the evapotranspiration. And then these shrublands that used to look like that have now converted to something else, have a very dramatic opposite pattern. So these post-fire shrublands have lots of leaves, right? And so the higher this fire severity, the higher the post-fire evapotranspiration. That's good for shrubs, but it's still leading to more drying than what was there before. Oak shrublands also are transpiring more water for more hours per day. So we see higher midday evapotranspiration in these shrublands. And then that this also sort of contrasts prior results. because like this is a different system. Like you saw lots of green stuff, right? So evapotranspiration, like when you cut trees down, you lower the number of leaves that can move water into the atmosphere, right? But in this case, this vigorous post-fire resprouting meant that there's lots of leaves out there. And so when we look at this kind of like thinking back to like these strategies that plants have, right? The one on the right and the one on the left do well in this like low severity fire regime because both adaptations work. But unfortunately, in the high severity fire environment, while we love this, people love pine trees, come on, right? This is the super plant, right? And so the question is like, that I'm trying to answer in a lot of my different projects is like, you know, is that a permanent thing? What does that mean for the future of forests or non-forests or shrublands in these environments? And so those are just a couple, that's just a couple of examples of like how I'm looking at the impacts of fire on landscapes, both in California and the Southwest. And now I'm going to talk about some projects where we're talking about what we can do about it, right? And so can we reverse the effects of fire suppression in frequent surface fire systems? So like, I'm specifically talking about these systems where frequent fire used to be the dominant fire regime, and we've seen a transition because people are messing things up, right? Okay, and so how do we understand fire risk? How do we reduce fire severity as a risk? And how can we increase forest drought resilience in the Anthropocene/Pyrocene? And so this is a paper that I have in review now with some colleagues at University of Maine at Farmington. We're in International Journal of Wildland Fire, where we're looking at the impacts of, or the drivers of wildfire severity over a 2-year period, so of intensifying drought from 2019 to the 2020 fire seasons across 5 different vegetation types in the state of Arizona. And so across Arizona, we have this like elevational change in vegetation that varies a lot with topography. But what we can see is that all of these different kinds of ecosystems, including the lowland deserts where most people live, are going to experience more fire and more frequent fire. And many of these places are, you know, WUIs, wildland urban interfaces. So we want to know about risk. And so what we did was we built a random forest model for all the fires that were bigger than 2,500 acres for those 2 years. Remember this fire severity triangle? So we built a multivariate model or data mining model to try to figure out what different things predicted fire severity. So these are the data we used. We use day-met data. So I do remote sensing. I do stuff on the ground. I measure trees, and I measure things on the from space with satellites. So we have day-met weather, precipitation, all these things leading up to the fire event, characterizing that. Then we have vegetation moisture concentration, both from this eco-stress sensor and then from another sensor, Sentinel-2 sensor, that is basically looking at vegetation moisture content leading up of a particular location on the ground leading up to a fire event. And then we have fuel and topography data from land fire. It's like the geospatial data clearinghouse for fire. And then we built this random forest model. Those are all the predictors. The response are fire severity data from the monitoring trends and burn severity data set. So basically, we're trying to figure out what of these things predicted how severe fires burned on the landscape, or how much vegetation they killed, right? Severity, that's that term I'm using. So guess what? Out of all these variables, NDMI, which is the moisture variable, was the #1 predictor across all these different environments. So how much moisture is in the vegetation actually was the #1 predictor of how severe or how much damage the fire did. And that's that, but then we also had things like canopy cover. And that makes sense, right? Fuels. And then pre-fire weather and topography were also important. Across the individual vegetation types in forests, things with trees, canopy cover was important. That makes sense in determining how severe or how much damage a fire does. The NDMI, that moisture thing, came up over and over again. So, so kind of in summary, we were also kind of testing some of the predictors, but like this is sort of telling you the story of what predicts how severe fires burn. And then we can use that information to try to understand like things we might do to mitigate risk, right? Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears and talk about adaptive management, right? So up until now, you know, we were basically trying to understand like what's happening, what are the drivers of what's happening, and then now I'm talking about, well, what can we do to reduce risk, right? And so there are tons of studies on how things like thinning, burning, thinning plus burning, or not treating a landscape will influence forest structure, right, after a fire, or will influence fire behavior right? And so what we see here is that untreated landscapes, like in this image, burn very severely, right, and kill most of the vegetation, while things that were thinned and burned are still green, right? Lots of papers documenting this, right? So I'm going to talk to you more, though, about forest drought resilience, which is like this added thing that happens from when you treat forests to reduce fire risk. So remember that water balance thing? I'm going to continue to talk about water balance. So a lot of my research is about fire, but it's also about how plants use water. And so this is an example from Chimney Springs in northern Arizona, in the Colorado Plateau, with my colleagues from Northern Arizona University and the University of Maine. And so the question that we're addressing in this study, or this set of studies, is can thinning enhance drought resilience, right? So this is back to the trees as straws, right? And so you can see more straws in the unthinned than the thinned, right? And so you could make some predictions probably about like water balance just based on what you see there, right? But the proof is in the pudding, right? So the Forest Restoration Initiative is the largest restoration initiative to date for the conterminous US for trying to treat and mitigate wildfire risk in the Pyrocene, right? And so 3.5 million acres across 4 different national forests in northern Arizona, using a variety of different types of prescriptions, right? So not just thinning or burning, but also very specific treatments based on like, are you trying to manage for goshawk habitat in this location, or et cetera, right? So pretty fine scale treatments put in here. But we're specifically working at one site right outside of Flagstaff in Chimney Springs. This is the UAV LiDAR imagery showing you the reduction in the canopy cover after the 2017 thinning event. My colleague Teki Sankey has been working there for a long time with a soil moisture sensor network, trying to understand how soil water balance changes in thinned versus unthinned stands before to after thinning through the present. And so what we've done is we've added sap flow data onto that matrix. So basically we've put sap flow sensors that measure tree level transpiration on a bunch of ponderosa pine trees. And we've also put in these Bowen ratio evapotranspiration stations that measure understory evapotranspiration. So stuff that's not trees like grass, like in that picture. Okay, and then what we're doing is trying to look at how hourly, daily, seasonal, annual evapotranspiration varies in non-thin versus thin stands. Okay? And so the other thing that we're doing is because, we used to get grants funded, we're validating the eco-stress instrument on the space station to see how good the ET measurements are. I'm going to talk about that too. Okay, so thinning. This is soil water potential. So like more negative means like more water. It's like more pressure pulling water out of the soil. If I got that right, Craig, in simple terms. And so what we see here is that clearly thin stands have more moisture than unthinned stands. And that is happening in June and July, which is like the peak drought before the summer monsoons come into northern Arizona, right? And so that's really important. It's quite an interesting and like helpful figure, right? And then by adding on the tree water use, we have a paper in review right now where basically we can see that, oh, this makes sense. Oh, guess what? Those straws that are left behind, they're using more water, right? So the thin stands with fewer trees, individual tree water use is significantly higher, and it's higher pretty much throughout the year, especially during that drawdown season. And then when we're validating the instruments, we see that eco-stress is picking up some of that signal. So we just published this paper a couple months ago. And what we see, however, is that and we see that that's tracking across the different in situ versus eco-stress, but what we also see is that eco-stress sort of overestimates it. And I think that's due to the fact that when you train like remotely sensed data, like they only use a certain number of sites, forest sites, and often ones that are carbon sites. So, but anyway, so it seems to be doing okay. So I think, my last statements about what's happening are probably fairly justified. But so essentially, just to kind of wrap this up, we are seeing the benefits of forest thinning and forest management on increasing forest drought resilience, and it's clearly shown that those activities also reduce wildfire risk. And so when we kind of look at how this all sort of fits together, one of the main management sort of concepts that people are using out west is the RAD concept, resist, accept, direct, right? And so there are like sort of 3 different ways we can think about, the future trajectories of our forests, right? So as I said, like no management is one decision, right? We're just gonna let it be. And if you give it enough time, everything will work itself out, right? But we're living in the Pliocene, right? Or living in the Anthropocene, right? And so like we've been living with fire for a really long time and using fire for a really long time. But we kind of forgot that because we've gone to this like 3rd fire, this pyro transition where all the fire we're using are fossil fuels that we combust in our lights and our cars, right? And so, so I would say that, yeah, there are ways that we can resist the risks or the impacts of increasing wildfire activity. And that has to do with things like maintaining frequent fire regimes on landscapes, right? So you've all probably heard the let it burn idea, right, in wilderness areas. But like really, if you just if there were more places in the world where you could let a fire move across a landscape, I have documented in several recent papers that those kinds of fires, when they're low severity, can really reverse the effects of fire suppression and thin out small trees, right? So that's one thing, resist. We're gonna have to accept some of these changes. So for example, a lot of the climate models say there won't be any ponderosa pine in northern Arizona in 100 years. So who cares about whether or not you do thinning or burning to manage it, right? Those are uncertainties. We don't actually know if that's true or not. Right? I still see baby ponderosa pines all over the place in Arizona, right? And they live a long time, right? But we may have to accept some of these changes. And there may be places that used to be forests that are no longer forests, and they're comprised by fire tolerant, moisture tolerant, deficit tolerant plants that are different than ones they had before. And then there's the direct, right? And so as a graduate of YSE, I'm a big fan of this one. Like there are things that people can do to try to, reduce fire risk and improve and sustain healthy forests, right? And so adaptive management in the Pliocene is really, really involves all of those things, right? And I know there's climate grief associated with like accepting some of these changes, right? But we need more fire primeval. We need to rebuild our relationship with fire, right? And remembering that we have been fire creatures for millennia on the planet. I gave you just a few examples of ways in which my lab, my colleagues, are trying to approach this question and but there are lots and lots and lots of examples. I think as with anything in the Anthropocene, right, it's a question of scale, right? So how do you scale these measurements? I talked with folks on the Forefry, like the head forest manager on the Forefry is like, I had to create markets for the wood, biomass we were taking out of this forest, right? So he had to figure out where, he basically sawmills, all different kinds of things, mastication, wood pellets, right? And so how do you bring that to scale so that you could actually thin 3.5 million acres or more, right? And then here's an example I just wanted to talk about. So Southwest Fire Climb is a climate and fire adaptation menu. It's a website that it has all kinds of information on it about how you as a manager or a landowner or someone interested in fire and climate adaptation in the Southwest could enact some of these practices on your landscape, right? And so this is an example. There are other examples in South Africa and Australia of other folks who are trying to do the same thing. And so in conclusion, I'm going to give you the curbing emissions thing, right? I'm sure you've heard it lots and lots of times, but that it's for real. Like that's really what we need to do, and so I think we still need to keep saying it. And then this large-scale adaptive management, going from this experimentation phase of like trying to treat landscapes at a large scale to actually like creating healthy landscapes that could then be able to experience low severity fire again when a match gets dropped, right? And then embracing more second fire, humans as the fire steward, and less third fire, enhancing this idea of a relationship with fire primeval, rather than this Promethean command and control power approach to fire and who gets firepower. So with that, I have had a lot of funders, a lot of students, a lot of folks work on this project, so I'll be happy to take any questions you have.
Yeah, thanks so much for that talk. So the question I have is about, it's kind of about how the public sees all of this. So it's not quite in the line of your research, but it seems to me that people don't really understand that like that change is okay and that fire is a natural part of a functioning ecosystem, but rather we want to like control it. So we think it's this way, so we're just going to keep it that way. And that mentality underlines a lot of the poor management practices in the past. So do you have any insight into how people can be communicated to, so that society can come to embrace some of these things that you're proposing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think, to be honest, I think the Australians probably have it a lot better than us. It's like, it's about getting the word out there and convincing people that this really has to change now, right? And I mean, it's very interesting also just on the forest fire, for example. I had the opportunity to go out with David Huffman, who was like, he put in the very first like thinning and burning plots out in the national forest around Flagstaff. And then, we went out in the field and got to see all those sites. But he was like, you wouldn't believe the community resistance. It was huge, right? And now you have the museum fire, you have all these fires around Flagstaff, and everyone's like, we have to thin these forests to protect our cities, right? So I think one of the major follies, and so in Australia, they've actually, it's always a lot, unfortunately retrospective, but in Australia, they've like redesigned full communities. So instead of what's happening in the Palisades, right, where you have people buying up lots and all these crazy things happening, insurance, no insurance, rebuilding, not rebuilding, right? In Australia, near Sydney, they had a similar fire from the Black Saturday fires. I'm trying to remember the fires in 2020, somewhere in there. They like redesigned their whole city to create a fire using a fire shed approach, where like they actually like could maybe sustain another wildfire and not have people out in the ocean the next time, like we saw in Maui, for example. So I think it really is like, I don't know what the mechanism of that is necessarily, but this whole, I mean, there is a whole colonial legacy as well of like why we're suppressing fire here, right? Like Gifford Pinchot, we most people know who he is here at Yale, right? So like, he brought forestry over here from a place that didn't have a lot of fire, right? Too wet. And then all of a sudden there's this fear of fire. It's an easy way to suppress people or cultures or groups of people in the West who use fire, right? So there's a lot of power in what's happened. So reversing that, I think, is kind of hard. But getting the word out there is the main thing. That's why I'm like talking about it today, is that people have had this long relationship with fire. It's fearful, and it's, like it's something that can kill you. So it's hard to talk about. But if we could get people thinking more about it, that might be a step in the right direction, or at least planning. There are these community wildfire preparedness programs, planning programs that there used to be federal dollars for, that, that you could like create a community wildfire protection plan, anyway.
Hey, sorry, I gotta go, but wow, what a great talk. That was one of the most sort of lively fire talks I've maybe ever heard. I love your framing about Prometheus versus primeval. I love your second fire versus third fire. You're a fire ecologist, and yet how many of these bullets are about climate change and fossil fuel emissions? The total amount of fire every year, stuff burned, is give or take 4 times as much fossil fuels are burned every year as biomass. 4 times as much Promethean fire or third fire. And that's causing the changes that you're talking about with respect to evapotranspiration and water balance and fuel dryness. And wow, what a link. Thank you for such a great talk.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you for a fantastic talk. I was wondering about fire management, because, for example, you mentioned that throughout history, humans have had a different relationship with the ecosystem that we live in. And for example, when humans first started using fire and introducing cattle, you mentioned manages or removes a lot of the fine fuels that those the historical fire regime, the historical fires would consume the low intensity fires. And now we are seeing a different step of this evolution where we even remove the cattle and we have this accumulation of fuels, and people are starting to talk in a lot of ecosystems. For example, in Portugal, where I'm from, let's bring the cattle again, because that way, I'm not sure we can reproduce the historical fires, but at least we can manage the very big catastrophic wildfires. So I was wondering if you have any insights on traditional fire management strategies here in the US, in Arizona, that people are maybe talking about bringing back to manage these flammable, highly flammable landscapes.
Yeah, that's a complicated question, but a good one. So there are people, to answer your first question about like livestock, for example. So there are a lot of folks talking about like not just livestock, but like mega herbivores, for example, were really prevalent on the landscape when fires were really prevalent a long time ago. So maybe we do need more herbivores or mega herbivores. But of course, at least in the West, what happens is the grasses everybody likes to, all the animals like to eat are not the same things that grow when you have cattle on a landscape. So mesquite, for example, I don't know if you've had shrub invasion in Portugal, but that's a big problem in the Southwest. And so then all of a sudden you do have this more flammable landscape. But adaptive management activities that people are doing to try to deal with that, are you talking more about the grassland type of rangeland systems? Or, I mean, in the rangeland systems, most people are in the US are dealing with sort of other kinds of fire problems, like an intensification of fire due to things like cheatgrass. So now the fires are really hot, and they didn't used to be. But yeah, I mean, these are all, like, I don't have any one solution, right? It's kind of like the whole problem with climate change itself, which is like, there's so many problems, so many parts to it that it's very hard to kind of figure out what to do about it. That's why I'm a big believer in adaptive management and thinking about trying to figure out, well, you know, we know that in Arizona, ponderosa pine forest, that these are your options for managing your stance to try to make it more drought resilient. And these are some things that you can do, or some targets for reducing stand density, or things that you can actually manage to try to keep your forest healthy.
Going back to the, thank you for the talk. Going back to the water quality question from the Los Angeles fires, I read a little bit about how people were concerned about the, you know, the impact of having household stuff being burned, or lead or metals or vinyl siding, like other kind of human-made materials getting into the soil or the water. And I don't know if it's something you've researched, but I'd love to know your thoughts about how these other impacts of materials being burned and entering into the ecosystem through these processes.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a big concern, and that's actually why we want to like expand the research into like the actual oceans to look at the turbidity plumes and things like that, so that we can actually look. But the main thing is that the E. coli data were like citizen science data that were freely available from like way before till after the fire, so that was an easy one for us to start to work with. But yeah.
Okay, well, let's thank Helen again.
Thanks very much.
We are going to extend the offer to anyone here. We're doing a little coffee chat. Helen and I will both be there down in Kroon 231 at 2. So if anyone wants to continue the conversation, you can meet us there. We'll have coffee and snacks. So.
Thank you.